Hi, I am Dinu Kumarasiri on behalf of Sri Lankan Women Techmakers and Google Anita Borg Scholars community. This session is a part of our Google Anita Borg Scholarship Mentoring Program, which is organized by the past scholars with the help of Google Women Techmakers Sri Lankan chapter. Today we have Kate Issacs, a fellow Anita Borg scholar from North America region, to share her experience about the scholarship. Kate Issacs is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Arizona. Her research interests include information visualization and high-performance computing. She earned her PhD from the University of California, Davis in December 2015. Previously, she earned a B.S. in computer science and a BA in mathematics from San José State University in 2011. Kate was awarded the Google Anita Borg Memorial Scholarship North America in 2015. Hi, Kate. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm great. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So this session will follow a conversational format where Kate will answer a few questions prepared by us about her experience as a scholar. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the panel right-hand side to the video in YouTube. We will pick them up for you at the end. So Kate, let's move on to the questions. So the most common question among the applicants these days is, what does I have to do for Google to select me as a scholar? So going along with that line of thought, as a scholarship recipient, Kate, why do you think you got the scholarship?
Well, I think the most important part of the application was the essays, because out of the things that I could personally control, these are probably the biggest differentiator. It's hard for reviewers to tell the difference on things like resumes alone, and they might not be particularly familiar with the kinds of outreach work that you do. In particular, I noticed that a common theme in this application across the various regions is this idea of leadership. And when I wrote my essays, I talked not about just the leadership where I had a leadership title, but things like when I took the lead on a class project. And then I also talked about my process through all of this as well. Of course, they're also going to look for things, especially looking at the application questions about how are you helping the community? But I think a lot of people probably discount what they do. So part of it was distilling what I did and being able to talk about it in a positive light, and the essays are what help with that.
Okay, so what was the most challenging thing you had to do for the application? Is it the essay? And how did you overcome your challenge?
Well, I think the biggest challenge was just deciding to apply. I waited for several years before I attempted because I thought, oh, everybody is so much better than me. They do better technical work and they do better outreach work. And it's really tough to put yourself out there when you know the most common response that people are going to get is going to be no. Nobody likes rejection, especially when you have to put work into it. But if you stop back and realize, oh, well, if the most common response is no, then no isn't actually bad. It's just normal. And that was very freeing because I realized, okay, I should go for it, because even if they say no, that doesn't say anything bad about me. It's just, in fact, it says it's good because I tried. And a good piece of advice I heard sort of along these lines in general is, if you're not hearing the word no, then you're not asking enough. Now, after I decided, okay, I'll take a chance here, then it was definitely procrastination on starting the essays, because you can stall because you don't know what to write or you're not sure. It's that first draft that I find the hardest, but you should. And so you have to start on that early, because going through several iterations will make it much stronger. And it's very tempting to wait until the last minute and do it the night before. But I think starting in advance somehow. And how did I overcome this? I think I set aside some time in which, all right, I'm devoting it to this time and I'm just going to write everything that I can and not worry that this first draft is not going to be good. It's not even going to be logical, have a good structure to it, but it's going to give me something to start with. So I think the two things that I overcame were, one, deciding that I was going to apply, and that was sort of a perspective shift. And the other thing was starting the essays in advance, and that was, again, this shift to, well, the first thing I'm going to write is not going to be great, but it's going to give me a starting point.
Okay. So even as you mentioned, the most common question a lot of students are having is, I don't do a lot compared to others. So what can I write about in the application? So what did you do for this?
So this is also sort of in tandem with that, let's just get a lot of stuff out there at first. And so this is part of a brainstorming process, because I bet you do a lot more than you think. And you shouldn't just discount those small things that you do because you think, oh, I could be doing more, or there's some imaginary perfect woman out there with the perfect application who's doing a ton of things. Like, don't worry about that person, because if she exists, there's not enough of her. And so it's just writing down the little things and then realizing in what I could go into in depth there, and also talking with other people, my friends, to remind each other, oh, remember that thing you did where you took this group of high school students to your school and showed them various technical aspects on campus? Oh, I completely forgot about that. And in another way, I think that if you don't have a whole ton to write about, it can kind of be a blessing in disguise, because that lets you focus the narrative of your essays on individual examples of what you've done, rather than just turning it into a list of things that don't really have any heart to them. And this is also back to this idea that there's leadership where you have a titled position, but that's not always the best story. Some of the things that you've done, you probably don't have that sort of titled recognition or that structure to, but they were still very important. So one scholarship, and I don't think it was this one, but a similar one, I spoke about work I was doing to influence a rather small group at my school. And I talked about what we had done to change the culture to one that applied for things like this and applied for research positions. And I mentioned individual stories of the impact I had and how these people who I had mentored had then gone on to mentor others. And so while the number of people I reached wasn't particularly large, the ripple effect, I think, really matters there, because if I do these things and then the people who I mentored then go on and mentor others, I think that's how we all help each other. So there's a lot of balance here in terms of, one, remembering that these things that you do, they're more impressive than you probably think. And when you think about things in sort of the narrative of how you help individuals, I think that can be very important, and you can write very strong essays based on those.
Yeah. So as many of you know, the scholarship application process involves submitting essays, and as Kate already told us. So Kate, what was your essay writing process like? So what are the questions you had in your round for the essays?
So my round was a bit different in that I think the first essay question was about how you got interested in computer science. The second was to talk about a leadership role, and not just, well, not really a role, but how you led or how you displayed leadership. And that wasn't just in terms of outreach. You could choose anything that you wanted. The third question was to explain a technical project to a student audience. So imagine you were talking to a group of students as an Anita Borg Memorial Scholar, now a Women Techmakers Scholar. And then the last one was about what you were doing to reach the goal of being 50-50 in computer science by 2020. And so I started out just by brainstorming what I could answer for each of these, like what had I done in support of all of these, and or for the first one, all of the reasons I loved computer science and why I started to get into it. So just wrote down everything I thought might help. And then in snippets, I wasn't even writing complete sentences at that point. And then I went through and I started cutting down, because these essays are rather short. So I had to decide what I was going to focus on, what I thought was maybe my best strength. And so I think there's always this this feeling that, oh, if I should list everything that I do, and I will use this giant mountain I have to overwhelm. And I think I left a lot of the things that I do out, and I think many of you, once you realize all of the things that you do, you'll have to leave some out too. And so when I was cutting that down, I was starting to think, what is the narrative of what I have left? How am I going to tell the story? Because when you think about what the reviewers are doing, they're reading a lot of these essays. So if you want to be memorable, you sort of have to make sure that you're following a narrative and that you're getting your message across. And so once I had that, then I started writing kind of, and it was great because I already had all of these snippets that I could work in. I started writing what's the story. And I think this is where you want to try to make your points clear. So one piece of advice I frequently hear is this idea of show, not tell, in that you want to show examples of what you're doing rather than just saying. So instead of saying, I am a leader, you talk about various examples of how you've displayed your leadership ability. Now, I'm going to say that show, not tell is not exactly what you want to do here. You want to show and tell, because these essays are short, people are reading a lot of them, so you don't want to have to make them connect the dots all by themselves. So you start with a topic sentence of what your main answer to the essay is, then you show through your examples how you're supporting that topic sentence, and finally you remind them at the end. So this is one of those instances where you don't want to get too creative with the writing. You want to make it as clear as possible. And by the end, when I was editing these essays, it came down to, does this sentence and this idea really support the point I'm trying to get across, or can it be cut for something better? Or am I explaining this example enough that people can follow my reasoning? And I was fortunate enough to get done a few days in advance and have a very nice friend who was willing to read over my essays and point out what didn't make sense, or typos, these kinds of things. So that was the entire process. And I know it sounds really long, but I think it can be done in small bursts of an hour or so, just over a longer period of time. And by the end, it was really sort of fun, because I think I became a better writer this way. And I think it's really good practice, not just for this application, but for others like it. And now, or well, not now, but when I was still a student and other essays came up, other applications, I already had these core written snippets that I could think about putting into these other applications. So there's a really nice sort of effect where once you apply to one of these programs, it makes it that much easier to apply to another, or to write maybe a statement of purpose for graduate school. So even when you do put work in, remember that it's not just this application that your work is going into, it's a lot of future applications as well.
That is a great piece of advice. So in Asia Pacific application process, it does not involve a recommendation letter. But for North America, you need 2 recommendation letters. So how did you pick a good recommendation letter writer? So this is a common question most of the students are having, because a lot of scholarships and grants require you to submit 1 or 2 letter of recommendation. So how do you select your recommendation letter writer?
So I think the most important thing about picking a recommendation letter writer is that the more the person knows you and your work, the better. So of course you want somebody who's going to know that you have strong technical grades. So even if you do know a professor very well, but you struggled in that professor's class, maybe you want to sit down and have a discussion to determine if they can write you a strong letter. But hopefully there are people who you did well in their class and they have some knowledge of your work. It might help if you did a project in that class, because that might stand out more than pure exams. And one thing to remember about this, and the reason why I make this suggestion, is because our essays are limited. They're very short. However, usually letter writers can write for as long as they want. So you want somebody who's going to be not only be able to say good things about you, but also cite several examples to illustrate these good things. So this is another example of being able to both show and tell. And I think especially for things like graduate school applications, when you're reading these letters, you look at them and say, can this person back up their claims and illustrate how the person that they're writing about matches this criteria and why they would be good for this position or for this scholarship. So this is why it's important to try to pick people who know you better or know your work better. If you worked with them in a research project or some sort of other project, or they were the advisor for a club that you ran, they've been able to see you work outside of class, that's great. But if you don't have somebody like that, think about the professors who you did really good work in their classes for. And then for certain scholarships, you might also want to consider, if you've had an internship somewhere or worked for somebody, your manager at that place. And if you're unclear whether that person is appropriate for any particular program, that's where you might want to send an email and just ask, would this person in this role be an appropriate letter writer? So for grad school, they might want to see academic positions more. For scholarships like this, I'm not entirely sure. For me, since I was a grad student at the time I applied, I had research advisors who knew my work best. But in other settings, I also picked internship advisors.
Mm-hmm. So after selecting the one to write the recommendation, how can I ask them to write me a recommendation letter? What is the approach you used for that?
So for me, I usually ask in person first, because this is very informal, and it also invites the possibility of maybe discussing the application and answering any questions the letter writer might have. If the letter writer then indicates that they'd be willing to do this, then I send them an email so that we have some sort of artifact that gives them all of the details and that I can refer to later. And one key phrase that's often recommended here is asking directly, would you be willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation? And that word strong here is important. Now, when you send the email, it's also very helpful to attach or link your resume and perhaps even your application materials if you have them, because this helps remind the letter writer of all of the things you've done. And when you have the application materials, they can also sort of make sure that they're gearing their letter to match your narrative as well. If you have a sense of what the selection criteria are for a particular scholarship or grant or grad school, you might also want to tell the letter writer what those selection criteria are and what you are doing to emphasize how you fill that criteria. Because again, that helps the letter writer figure out what they should be emphasizing in their letter as well. Like a letter for a pure technical scholarship is probably going to have a slightly different flavor than one such as this one that also cares about the outreach work that you do. Another thing that you should do is send reminders. So you want to ask far enough in advance. I think a month is pretty good. So this gives them plenty of time to write the letter or to schedule time to write the letter, as often these people are quite busy. And then if they haven't submitted, if you can check that, you might want to remind them a week out or a couple days out or both, depending. And so sending a reminder or reminding them in person can help a lot.
Okay, so back to the scholarship. So do you think your resume played a role in winning the scholarship?
So I think that having a strong and well-written resume was necessary, but not sufficient. So I don't particularly think my resume at the time that I applied was particularly differentiating. I think there are a lot of people who probably had similar resumes or perhaps stronger resumes. However, at the same time, I think the fact that my resume was well polished helped, and the fact that it could list things that I didn't talk about in the essay, that probably didn't hurt. So I read, before I crafted my resume, not just for this application, but also applying for internships, I read a lot about writing resumes on the blog Ask a Manager. And so this was done to present the best resume I could. And so some of the tips Ask a Manager had things like explaining in the bullet points under your internships what the positive results of your work were, or putting a summary at the top to summarize your skills and who you are and what you've done. And so this helped me, I think, structure my resume so it could look as the best as possible. But this was really something that I had done more to apply for internships. And so I think it certainly didn't hurt my application, but I don't think it was necessarily the differentiating factor. Of course, another thing is, I think, Google is collecting resumes through this process. So of course, I want Google as a company to have the best version of my resume that they can.
Yeah. So here's our final question. So after this, we'll be moving to answering the questions from the audience. So the question is, what difference did the scholarship make in your life and career?
Well, so first is the easy answer, in which I used a significant portion of the scholarship to pay my tuition my last semester of graduate school. But it's also, I've made several friends through the scholarship. So if you win the scholarship, Google has a retreat where they bring people from not just this scholarship, but also their related ones, like the Generation Google Scholarship and the Lime Scholarship, to meet at this retreat and discuss what we can do to improve computing. And it's not just the retreat, though. They set up things like a Slack for the Women Techmakers group, Google Circles. And I've met various people through that, and these people are people I keep in touch with, and it's really great to see their careers grow and my own career grow. And I feel like outreach and increasing the inclusion in computer science is important to me, and being part of a community that does that, I think, is very exciting, and it sort of feeds the soul in many ways. And so I think it's great to be a part of this community and also be able to talk to the people who run the Women Techmakers program at Google about ideas that we have to make things better, and knowing that, well, here's a good source of support. I can direct maybe my projects or the projects of the students around me. So it's not only nice having this money and paying for my tuition, but also being part of this greater community.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to the questions from the audience. So we have one question there. Did you add any links as references to your work when you were writing your essay answers?
So I did not put links in my essays, but I did have links to some GitHub accounts in my resume.
Okay. So that's all for today. Thank you, Kate, for joining us and sharing your experience. It was very inspirational. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a good night or good day, depending on your time zone. Bye.
Bye-bye.